Very happy and pleased to welcome Chris. Chris, welcome to the Vitrina podcast.
Thank you.
Um, and pleasure to have you here, especially to discuss all the things that are happening in LA and Hollywood, as well as the outlook for the year. We would love to understand that piece as well. And then, with your sort of specialization in VFX, I hope to cover a few discussion points relating to VFX, some of the changes that are happening in the industry, and essentially get your outlook. So.
Well,
Uh,
glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So, Chris, I would love to get your introduction. Everyone within the industry knows you as the co-founder and chairman of Crafty Apes, and also the founder at Luma. But would be great to sort of get that perspective from you in terms of how the journey has been.
Yeah, no, founder at Luma Logic. There's a very big, famous VFX company called Luma that my buddy founded, but I didn't found.
Luma Logic.
No, Luma Logic's not it's a not VFX company, but no, yeah, no, happy to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, VFX has been. I mean, everyone's been hit hard this year.
That's
The
right.
it's. I mean, you guys are one of the few people actually tracking it, so you see it better than anyone. But we feel it. It's the after the industry got tripped up during COVID, things went down, and then when they rushed back so hard,
That's right.
there's this regression to the mean. But I think it's beyond just the regression to the mean from coming out of COVID with everything that backed up. I think that's compounded by the debt markets, and so the interest rates, coming out of COVID in 21, going into 22, you had all this cheap money still, and so as everyone built up their pipelines and their all this stuff came out, the spend went crazy. We saw, I think, in scripted episodic for North American English, there was 599 scripted narrative shows in 2022,
That's right.
and from the people I'm talking to now, we're seeing somewhere in the mid to high 300s, in titles, and for this next year is projected, and so it's who knows what the mean's going to be. I've seen some projections that suggest that theatrical production, film production won't reach the 2019 levels until 2026.
Right.
But really, it's all just it's conjecture. You don't really know until you know you see what happens. I mean, the Fed indicating that interest rates could drop in June is a very positive thing for the film industry because so many of these things are financed on debt. I think a lot of people think that movies are just someone writes a check for $100 million, and it's like
Right.
no, that's not exactly how it works. And
That's right.
but those debt markets, that's how a lot of movies are, financed, and so the when that market tightens up, movies tighten up with it, and compounded with the strike and everything like that, and all of a sudden you have this kind of perfect storm.
That's right.
And
That's right. That's right. And in fact, even some of the numbers that we were tracking for 22 in productions, the gap has constantly increased between what the 22 levels were as the year has progressed in 23. And of course, the year started with definitely lesser than the 22 levels, and then the strikes hit, and that really has increased the gap.
the downside of what happened during COVID is, or post COVID, is when everyone released all this stuff all at once and just built up, it's an arms race. And so what happens is the actual value of each individual project goes down. Everyone ends up devaluing their own assets. And so what you end up, so when you think about that, you're like, okay, well, if you're say, an investor at a streamer, you're trying to maximize your return. Well, if what used to buy you a lot of money in the back end, whether through advertising or subscription, is no longer there, well, you're going to go, where's the next amount of subscribers? I mean, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure I've seen it before, but if Netflix has however many hundreds of millions subscribers they have, where's the next market to go to? What's an emerging market?
Right.
You have
Right.
India with 1.4 billion people, China with 1.4 billion people,
That's
and
right.
while the per person consumer spend isn't there, it doesn't matter because you're going to get it through quantity. I think you're going to see a bigger and bigger global spend because you have to diversify. And the union strikes only affect North America. That doesn't affect Europe. That doesn't. It's you can still when you look at what was still going on over the last 9 months, it's a lot of filming in the UK, in Europe, in Africa. There's all these places that Asia. So they're not. you don't have global unions. I mean, you have it in some industries, but not in film. It's all fragmented. So
That's true.
I think there's this sort of, when you really look at what LA or Hollywood is, I think, when me and you were growing up, there's a perception like that's where all movies come from. And, as the world changes, and things like AI and technology accelerate the change even faster, that people are like, wait, LA is really just, granted, I say that I lived there for a long time and I loved it, but it's really it's a network. It's a collection and a network. There's nothing, back in the day, LA was represented a place that was far away from Thomas Edison to avoid the patent problems, and it was 72 and sunny every day, so you could film consistently. But as technology progressed and stages and all these things, you realize that you can do that same thing anywhere. And what it is, it's just a collection of people with the same interests in one place, which is very important because,
Right.
but gradually you're going to see that, I think, erode as a power center,
Right.
as people figure out, and, you get, Bollywood's technically been larger in terms of certain, at least in
Just
manpower
the
for a
total
number of
output.
years.
Just the
Yeah.
output.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
You
make
know,
many more movies. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, granted, I would say probably the quality's probably not there just yet, but it's
Hmm.
getting there. And so it's like this idea. I mean, you see this happen all the time. If you have a populace that's maybe such a gap wealth wise to other populations, you're going to start to have that, you know, this idea of American exceptionalism. And really what it is it's resource exceptionalism, and
Hmm.
culturally there's some things that help play into it in terms of how the culture is structured, but by and large, if given the same scenario, everyone would be doing the same thing in any environment. We're all just kind of born into these dealt these hands, and so
That's
this
right.
idea that the rest of the world's not going to catch up in these, I mean, it's one of the few areas where America still stood out, and I think we will for a bit in some areas, but you see what's coming out of Korea in the market. It's really when it comes down to is the ability to tell um, captivating stories, and
Right.
that's why people go back to the well for these things. And I think the more you mix in, there's a balance between the business side of it and the creative side of it. And if you let one get, if you go, if one goes too crazy, creative goes too crazy, you get people spending like you get 100 million on just a weird art film, and then if you go to business, then no one takes any risks, and they're just after
The same.
existing IP, whatever appeals to the four quadrants, and you get the
That's right.
lowest common denominator. And so you can look overseas towards a lot of unique stories, especially stories people have never seen before in existences.
You,
So yeah,
in fact, I was curious just on that particular point about risk taking. From your vantage point, Chris, have you seen uh, streaming as a net positive or a net negative vis-a-vis broadcast? Just in terms of the risk appetite, because broadcast was so ratings driven at one point when broadcast was the only thing that was happening in town. That they were like just too safe and too careful, and a lot of people would accuse broadcasters of not taking risk enough. And then
yeah.
the streamers came in, and now, I would love to get your viewpoint on that piece actually.
Well, I think there's something between those two things that really improved episodic, and that was cable television. And
Right.
so, if you go back to like the 50s, 60s, when everything's broadcast, well, that means everything is tied to commercial clients. So, you used to see at the front of things like, Kellogg's presents, and then, now we do that with like stadium naming. But if you imagine like if I had Seinfeld and I said, M&M's presents Seinfeld, we would think of that as strange. But that's just what we're used to. But our parents were like, no, that was normal back then. But
That's right.
that model means that the advertisers actually, because they're the ones really funding the whole thing, have a huge amount of say in what goes on. And so if you take a risk from a story point of view, or from a cultural point of view, well, that advertiser might disappear. I mean, you see it all the time. Somebody's whatever Elon Musk said this week that made somebody mad. What's the first thing you hear? These advertisers pull out. So that's always the thing. It's like,
That's right.
I mean, even when you saw, was it Puff Daddy had to step down yesterday? Why do people have to step down? Someone of that stature has to step down. Oh, it means that people with money are threatening to, like, they don't want to be the association. So as broadcast had to be safe because it had to be watched by children, basically. It had to appeal, it had to be very, and so when cable television came out, and we got HBO and the Cinemax starting in the 80s, they
Right.
could take risks on things and they could tell stories that were a bit darker. And so it was, really, a lot of people would say it was The Sopranos was the first time we saw like cinematic television. I think you could argue The Wire, but you saw this all of a sudden. Most of television was really more akin to videotaped theater. If it was a three wall sick, even things like, or, like Gunsmoke really feels like you're watching a play. And the scope was very small, and I mean, you can still tell wonderful stories in there. Obviously, MASH, Seinfeld. I mean, there's a Cheers, but it's a very specific format. And if you want to imagine like an 80s version of Breaking Bad or something, all shot on stage somewhere in Culver City, it's not the same
Yeah.
thing. And so
That's right. That's right.
cable opened up those whole stories. And so from the quality, say about year 2000 to when streaming really starts coming up, say 2014, for making their own productions, um, you really see some of the best television ever. You see Mad Men, you see Breaking Bad, you see, I mean, endless, I can go on and on of how many, great shows there are. As streaming comes out, I think it upends the business model, but I think from a creative standpoint, it's a better thing. My reasoning is that if you go back however many years, 20 years, and you look at the amount of shows being made then versus now, it's way more now. And
That's right.
so
That's right.
while a lot of people will talk about like the mid-budget drama disappearing, which generally it has, but at the same time you have all these streaming movies and that would have made it. I'm glad
That
somebody's making
probably.
it. I'm glad
Right.
somebody's making it, but I think that culturally, when you grow up and you want to be a filmmaker and you want to be involved in film, you always imagine the theater. That's like the pinnacle. You picture you're at a film festival or whatever, and it's in the newspaper, it's opening, and people get so locked into that. And I agree, it's a wonderful experience. It's one of the reasons I love film. We all love the theater, but people get so locked in that they can't imagine seeing it anywhere else.
Right.
Like if you look at the pecking order of what of what it means to be a director. So at the top's like film director, say Scorsese,
Right.
James Cameron. If one of them was directing television, you'd be shocked. Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, oh my god, But all of a sudden, because of cable, it became a respected medium. I mean, the stuff David Fincher makes, and a lot of these, people make now when they go into, because you look at what is a 10 episode. It's really just a big long movie. They're
Right.
not making procedurals. They're not making Law and Order. They're making serials, the uh, and so these are big long movies, and so it's that prestige starts to change. But I think people can't imagine all this work for it not to be seen in the theater, which is why you see hybrid stuff where Netflix will release it in the theater for a couple of weeks. Sometimes that's for Academy Award qualifications, but um, a lot of times it's to appease the filmmakers so that they can have that experience and people, you can see it how it's supposed to be shot. And, there's, I get it. You saw that there was a thing a couple years back where David Lynch was, he was angrily ranting on YouTube or something about people watching stuff on their phones. And it's like, I agree from my generation's point of view that's like a crisis. But at the same time, things change. And
Right.
if you go back and there's a great website called pessimistarchive.org where it shows people's cultural reactions to different pieces of technology for the last couple hundred years. Like see people's reaction to, the horseless carriage, to computers, to the phonographs. And every time people kind of say the same crap, like, oh, this was wonderful until this happened. And
Right.
Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, has a great quote on this about how our opinion on where technology is largely based on the time we're born in. And when we hit a certain age, anything that comes after that, we're like, well, that's just, you're crazy. We shouldn't, that's Pandora's box. But it just so happens that the inventions that happened up until that point were just totally fine. And
Right.
so this is just classic, like, we exist in place, but we also exist in time in terms of our perspective on the world. And we
That's right.
forget that a lot of people have many other standpoints, just like, the American exceptionalism myth that somehow no one else will catch up because, well, we're awesome and they're not. And it's not something people say, but it's kind of when you listen, that's kind of what they're thinking. And it's like,
Right.
well, how will they catch up over there? And
Right.
it's usually just resources,
Okay.
and but it's the culture of America does actually have quite a reward system for innovation, which is why people come here. I mean, it's probably why you're here. It's like and I have noticed that when I've worked overseas and done things, that reward system isn't as in play as much there as it is here. So you're probably going to see more innovation here. But the I largely in this time and place, the reason we've been so far ahead really has to all go back to World War II. In fact, the whole world was blown up except for us, and everybody owed us money. So we got to ride. It's like starting off a track race, but you get to start off a mile ahead. So
That's
eventually, people start to catch.
that's right. That's right. That's right. One aspect closer home for you for VFX, which are the last three big milestones that you think have really changed the VFX piece of the industry, especially from your vantage point. I know that there are more changes coming our way in that domain, but what are the three things that have happened that have really transformed VFX? Um,
In my over my career recently.
just the last three big changes that have happened.
Last three big changes. Well, I mean, I'll start off. I'll go backwards, but then
Sure.
I'll come back again. So right now, AI is going to change everything. Machine learning. That's going to be that's the biggest by far. You go back a little bit before that. You could argue that virtual production, it's a bit, but I think it's more of a minor impact in terms of affecting VFX. I think the uh, the rise of television is a big one. That's if you look at where revenue comes from. You know, traditionally, when I started my career, so say back early 2000s, what would happen is things were there was three pots. This is a generalization, but in
Sure.
general, it was like this as from an artist and from a visual effects house standpoint. So you had television, you had film, and you had commercials.
Yeah.
And there were these other things called music video people, which were kind of like not allowed inside the house. And so, and I came out of music videos, so I could say that because it's funny. But the pecking order. Remember, I had my agent in LA who represented me as an artist. And he said, "Okay, film, film compositing is the top, for being a compositor." He goes, then commercials, then television. So when I started off, television was like bottom tier. And I did a job probably in '05, early on in my career, that was a television miniseries. And I can tell you the work wasn't, for what we had, it was good. But compared to anything else, it was not great. It didn't look good. And that won an Emmy Award for visual effects that year. Now you dial up 7, 8 years later, and
Whoa.
Game of Thrones is going. So in a very short period of time, you realize television went from like kind of like my friend, this buddy of mine, Kevin, who's been a long time VFX guy in television, starting in the '90s actually,
Hmm.
would tell me some of these hilariously low budgets they had for visual effects. I'm talking major shows, like major shows that you were like, that's all you guys had. He goes, yeah, we had to figure it out. And those things were separate. You didn't have how you had occasionally, but houses didn't. You had television houses, film houses, and you had commercials, and there were different types of people. And so, but all of a sudden, when we started our company, we were all film people, and we started talking to some people and realized that, oh wow, a lot of these companies, just these big major famous companies that are going out of business were all film companies. But who's high on the hog? Oh, it's the companies doing television.
Hmm.
So all these companies that had sort of cornered the television market, and you're like, well, who's doing the effects for this CW show or this thing on CBS? Or, who does the
Right.
effects for NCIS or who are those VFX houses? While prestige level, they didn't get the best seat at the bar. Business wise, they were making way more money, and
Wow.
they had a stable, stabler business. And so that looking at it from a business point of view, the rise of televisions, I mean, you look at just the quality, and and
That's
that coincides with the kind of stories that are being made. If
right.
you're only making sitcoms, you don't need amazing stuff. You don't have dragons and stuff like it's like. But as you get up there and you're doing these big long serialized productions they're basically big films, you need that quality. So you look at a lot of that work and a lot of these big episodics, like we work on Stranger Things and stuff. I mean, that works as good as the film work.
That's right. That's right.
It's right. They take it just as seriously, and so that's where a lot. Traditionally, if you really wanted to make money in the entertainment industry, TV was a way better place to be than film. Because of the way the deals were structured with residuals. I mean, Larry David with Seinfeld and Jerry have every time it syndicates. As soon as you hit syndication, you're just the amount of money that someone like Dick Wolf must make is insane because And anywhere in the world right now, Law and Order is playing somewhere. They have so much content, they can just have a Law and Order channel on repeat, and so that syndication is the real value. And so you in television, that's why things like CSI or NCIS, that's why they spin them off so much. Is you end up with hundreds of episodes, and it's a payday. It's a massive payday. The
Wow.
film will never return like that.
Fascinating. I was curious. I mean, was that the opportunity that kind of led you to? What's the story of Crafty Apes? I mean, when you started the company, was what were you still sort of seeing that potential to?
We didn't see the TV side. We did identify what we would call an irrationality in the market or an undervalued asset in the market, and that's why we started. It was you don't if you approach
Would be
things. Oh,
would be
go,
great. Sorry, Chris. Would be great to sort of get a little bit of a story relating to how Crafty Apes started off. That'd be
Okay, yeah. So Crafty Apes was founded by myself, my brother Tim, and my friend Jason, who's our producer. Me and Tim were artists, and still are, I guess. And um, we started to we started the company in 2011 in Los Angeles, and a couple years before that, we had observed something happen. So for me, what it was is I think it was 2007 or 2008. I was at a VFX company, and I was like I was one of our compositing supervisors. So one of your stronger compositors. And the head of the company came to me one day and she said, "Hey, can you come in this Saturday
hmm
to you have to do 15 beauty shots on an actress and remove a bunch of acne from her face or whatever, um and the client will be there, super VFX supervisor, and can you just knock these shots out on a Saturday?" I'm like, "Sure." So I go in there, and it's 2008. At the time I was $55 an hour. So I get overtime, so I put in maybe 10 hours. So let's say $80 an hour, time and a half, 10 hours. I walk away with $800 then, you know.
Right.
But federal California taxes, I probably walked away with $20. But like, the um and I
Right.
remember asking her because I knocked all the shots out, we're good to go. And I said, "Hey, how much did we charge the client for?" And she said, 25,000. And I was like,
Whoa.
"What?" And because like, wait a second, what? And so that's the first time I had spent so much time just trying to be a good artist that I never had really. I was just very much. It was classic sort of like proletariat labor. I wasn't thinking about the business side of it. There were the owners who were the wizards behind the curtain doing their thing, and I was
Right.
there to be. I was just happy to be there.
Right.
And when I started to, as I got better and I got more comfortable, I started observing things like this, and I started looking at the business side because people would talk about what a terrible business VFX was. Well, and so I really started to look at it, and what I realized was that, and I'm not going to comment on it philosophically. I'm just going to tell you what I observed is that the reason why a lot of companies were going out, is it turns out there was a lot of money to be made in VFX on a lot of stuff, but it wasn't glamorous or fashionable. It was a lot of the meat and potato stuff. It was stuff
Right.
like I was doing on that actress. It was 2D green screens. It was cleanups. It was a lot of invisible effects.
Right.
And it wasn't making Thanos. You're not going to get awards for this stuff, but
Yeah.
it was very stable. What I realized is that where you lose money is when you do the big fancy 3D crazy stuff that you win awards for, like what happened, Rhythm and Hughes, Light for Pi. When you do amazing stuff that tends to have you very CG heavy and things like that, that's where you lose money. So if you don't augment that stuff with the meat and potatoes, you're gonna go under. And so we observed that more and more. So what happened was is yeah, this other buddy of mine, who's my supervisor, I was telling him about my theory on this. And so the company I was at ended up collapsing, and I was talking to my buddy a couple months later, and he goes, "Hey, I tried our theory out." I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Oh, there was this, you know, mid-budget, just run-of-the-mill movie, with a very
Right.
famous actor though, and he's famous enough to where he had a lot of beauty work to do, teeth whitening, zit cleanup, stuff like that.
Right.
Well, the the big VFX company on the movie didn't. They said they didn't care about doing that type of work.
Oh.
And so the producer of the film, the VFX, came to my buddy and said, "Hey, they don't want to do it. I'll just keep their bid. Do you want to do it?"
Nice.
So my buddy does it, and he makes 400,000 in like 4 weeks.
Jeez.
I'm like,
Wow.
there is a hole. There's a hole in the market here. And so
Right, right, right.
when you start thinking about, I mean, as a human, it's a good thing to engage in empathy and imagine what it's like to walk around other people's shoes. But where it's, I'm not going to say as valuable, but it's valuable equally in a different ways in business.
Right.
So in business, if you're able to think about, say, what your competition is doing, or how consumers think, or how, how do these people operate? When you start, so you imagine the VFX business, and you imagine, first of all, it's wrong to imagine it as an actual, like, we tend to think of things as these sort of monolithic central brain Borg things, but they're not. What it is a bunch of siloed pieces. So when you say the VFX industry as a whole, what that means is here's 1,000 projects with 1,000 different teams that have to get stuff done. They don't talk to each other that much. They don't really know
That's
what
right.
each other's doing. They're siloed. So now, if you look at what a story has told you about my buddy, why could that happen? Well, it's because there's no centralized source overlooking this whole thing. Someone had already allocated that money for that stuff. It had already been signed off on, so it just had to get done. No one really looks that hard at it. If
Right.
you're a client, you're just trying to get your project done. The only
That's right.
people that look hard at stuff are like independent filmmakers and music video people and startup guys who have to look at every penny. Other than that, people stop looking at that. They just like, yeah, that's what it costs. And they're not out trying to get a deal on everything. So when you find that those holes in the market, like what is the where's the it's like you take dailies in post production, in production.
Right.
Everyone knows that dailies yield like an 80 to 85% profit margin for post production houses. It's probably their main revenue stream,
That's
but
right.
nobody fights against it. Producers don't come in and say, well, "Can I get this for half?" You're still going to make 40%. They just accept it because it's most of the time it's not their money.
Right.
If it's if I said, Atul, you're spending $1 million on this movie, you're going to be looking at everything. And if someone's
That's
sitting around at the craft services table smoking, you're like, what are you doing? But when you're spending someone else's money on a corporate level, well, what humans do is they tend to just they compare themselves to each other. They don't compare themselves to an optimally efficient system. So if everyone's kind of like accepted mediocrity in terms of efficiency, then everyone says, oh, we're all doing a good job.
right.
It's like I'm sure the car industry all thought they were doing a good job, for environmentalism until
Yeah.
all of a sudden Tesla comes out, and it's like, wait, what is, and it's like, so that, which is ultimately why competition is a good thing because it keeps you on your toes. But given the opportunity with no outside influence into this, people will tend to go towards the easiest, lowest common denominator. What's the lowest expenditure of energy? And so if there's no incentive, so we discovered is when it came to work that wasn't fancy or sexy, a lot of people just didn't care about it. It was like, so you were able to come in and just swoop in and grab all this work, which when you add it all up is worth a ton of money.
Wow.
But individually, it doesn't win you awards, but all of a sudden you're stable and you're actually, and it depends why you're doing it. Are you there for ego? Are you there for creativity? What are you there for? So what we ended up evolving into is, at our heart, yeah, we're creatives, we're artists, we want to make cool stuff. So we would mix stuff. So we would
Awesome.
do some high end stuff that pushed us creatively and challenged us technically and all these things. But it was always augmented with stuff that was paying the bills.
And
That
almost
you
at a foundational level, the meat and potato stuff, as you called it, is really the strong foundation. And then you can is that kind of the way
yeah
the story evolved?
yeah yeah. It's like if you're gonna win if you're managing a baseball team, you're
Right.
not going to win just cranking out, trying to hit homers every time. It's you got to have people hitting singles and doubles, and no one's ever won just crank. No one hits 10 homers a game. It doesn't know how it works. And so
That's right. That's right.
you have to mix these things. Just like so much of what we know, it's a balance. And but when you start looking at the world from everyone else's point of view, and you start looking, that's how you become a good business owner because you're able to service your clients because you know what they're looking for. You know what their
Right.
worries are. I mean, why does anyone hire anyone? Well, to do things and to really to mitigate risk and to basically get rid of their fears. If we can get rid of people's fears and solve the problem, that's what people pay for. And
Right.
so the And so in doing so, you can identify all different holes in the market. Where is there a lot of reward for a low amount of effort?
Right.
As much as possible, because that's classic pleasure principle, and that's what everyone's trying to do in business. And so, it's like what you see right now with the rise of AI and all these businesses, which are really just quickly slapped UIs on top of OpenAI's ChatGPT. It's like we just slapped a thing over the API, and now we're calling it a new business, but it's just a guy in a dorm room who's like, oh, maybe I'll make a couple 100,000 off this doing nothing, you know.
That's right.
So that's humans want to do that. So there's no there's always this idea we think that we just have this innate idea built into us. I don't know if it's on a genetic level that there's some kind of centralized source pushing all the controls and moving things, which is maybe where God comes from. But when you
Yeah.
get into the real world, you realize it's a
Right.
whole big confluence of different competing, siloed out little feudal systems. And
Right.
if you imagine humans on a top-down level moving as little dots, that you realize there's no centralization of this. Like it's all these little sort of systems, and so that's a way more complicated thing to understand, which is why it's easy to simplify and say that it's like conspiracy theorists. It's like this idea there's some guy in a chair with a cat and it's dark, and it's like no, there's why do you think everyone at this level wouldn't also be competing with each other just like everyone is at this level? It's the same everywhere, and so
Fascinating.
you start finding these irrationalities, and that's where I think you can figure out okay, that's the best place to put our efforts.
Got it. Got it. I know that's a great story. Again, totally resonates with the key insight that guided your journey. And what's the story behind Luma Logic?
Well,
Um,
Luma Logic, something similar, and so that's
okay.
a startup, that I've launched this year, and that's the idea is based on a lot of things I observed in the film industry, and so this will tie back to what we were talking about with streamers and stories. That
That's right.
when you have people, so we always hear the massive cost of these films, and so now you have a debt crisis. And what I observed in being on set for a long time, because VFX is one of the few industries that's there from the start to the end. So not always, but a lot of times I would be with these filmmakers from the very birth of the project to the very end. And so I have this vantage point to observe what happens to the vision. Is all these forces at play affect this filmmaker's vision, how it gets changed and they compromise and they're doing this dance. And you realize that most of the money in film doesn't end up on the screen, or a lot of it. And too much of it does not. And so you start really looking at that and start thinking once again, looking at the world from other people's shoes, and thinking about the almost what on some level appears to be the chaotic nature of things. You look about why a lot of these things came to be. Why is the film business the way it is? Why have we adopted these sort of institutions and structures as the process of making a film? And could we improve upon them? So
Right.
when I started looking at that, I went back to screenplay, you know, screen. And you start looking, okay, what is the best, most efficient way to
True.
get this to this? Let's rethink the whole process. So example I like to use is take offline editing. Well, why did offline? What problem is offline? Theoretically, every structure and tool exists to solve a problem. Well, what does offline editing solve? Well, we used to have film. We had to scan it, which was expensive, and you needed a way to represent it and be able to move it quickly and cut with it. And computing power was only so much, so you had offline editing, which was a proxy representation of the final film. Well, we don't shoot film anymore, really. And
Right.
computing GPU power especially is at a point where why do we have offline editing? Why isn't the online just there the whole time? Even at 4K, 8K, it's like my GPU will tear through that. So it's like, oh, there's an entire system that shouldn't exist now. A step in the process. Let's remove it. But
Fascinating.
ultimately, what I observed was, can you think of any other industry where someone spends $100 million and doesn't know what they're getting?
Wow.
Besides the U.S. military, who spends $100 million
Right.
and doesn't know what they're getting? And so think about that. The way movies are made is they plan it, as much as they can. A lot of times they're so rushed, and they go shoot a bunch of stuff according to this process everyone's agreed to is like the way to do it because once again, groupthink of it to an extent. And there's a logic to all this. I mean, the stuff didn't exist for no reason. I just think it solves problems that somewhat older. And so they do this stuff. They go in the editing room. They do some stuff. They maybe do some 10 VFX, do as much as they can. They have a screening where it's half done, sound, music, VFX aren't done.
Right.
And they go to the people that have spent $100 million. They go, ta-da! And then everyone, and then that's when those people finally see it. And granted, those people are watching dailies and they're seeing it as, but it's kind of crazy. So one of the reasons we started the company, Observing Irrationalities, was how much money people would spend in post to try to fix things that we either story problems or execution problems. So let's go to VFX. Well, that's really expensive to change it at that stage in the process. So my thing was, hey, we need better ways to visualize what the final product is going to be. So as I got into the machine learning AI a couple years ago, it started to occur to me that language models could they could parse the scripts and start to create an understanding of what's in them. Then I was like, okay, well, could we tie that into game engines and put some models on top of that understand cinematic language and why cuts happen, what angles are, give it all that. And then could you feed a script in and then visually see the whole movie?
Wow.
People talking, music. So
That's
let's move the final product to the start of the process, because I could draw you a stick man and you're like, yeah, that's a man. You don't need much, but so game engine quality is beyond enough. Game engine quality is great. And so now the filmmaker, I imagine the process would upend, but the filmmaker and the editor and the artist would start at the beginning where it's very cheap. There's only a couple of them, taking the script, making the movie. And what's going to happen is things about the screenplay which don't reveal themselves on the page, but when you actually shoot it, jump out at you, which happens all the time. Which you're always like, well, how did that not make sense to the writers? And it's like, well, on a screen, on the page, it seems fine until you watch it, and you're like, that doesn't work at all. That happens all the time. Well, right now, we don't see that until we do it. Now, if you have a way to do that early on, you're going to see where the screenplay's slow, where the movie's slow, where it can be sped up. So story-wise, you're going to be able to iterate very cheaply because there's only a few people involved, and then be able to show the studio or whoever, hey, this is what we're making. Everyone's going to go, oh, great. Then,
completely.
because it's now a game engine, every attribute, whether it's a shoe or a location, an actor, actress, a prop, whatever, that's already going to be in there. Well, guess what? It's in a perfectly database out environment where you can tag your metadata, tag everything. Then it's a
Right.
question of what is the best way mixed with the best quality of how to achieve that. So if it's a tool in his office, well, do we go on stage? Do we go to a house? Do we put them on green screen? What? And so you combine all these things together, and if you know the costs and the time for these, well, then it's an easy optimization algorithm to say,
Right.
here's the most efficient way to do this. And so you have cost savings now, because my thesis was that you can't pay people any less per day than they're making right now, and you
Right.
can't lower the quality. So what do? Well, we have to cut down the amount of shooting days by better planning, which I think is a good thing. And so what this is going to do a number of things. So now that the producers can very quickly see that what things are going to cost, the most efficient way to do them, and of course, like it's filmmaking, stuff's going to go bad on set. You're going to get rain days. You're going to have to be able to build all that in. But one of the biggest things is what I noticed being on set a lot is, unless you could afford previs or a storyboard, or really people didn't know the vision of what they were making. The
Right.
crew, I'm talking the people who actually make the movie, the crew members, the department heads, the ones actually doing it. So much of the time they didn't know why they were doing it and what they were really part of. They hadn't even read, a lot of them hadn't read the script. Right? It's a job. Well, the way you bind people together, humane in a human sense, psychologically, is you give them all a vision of what you're doing. You don't silo them. You don't say, oh, you're just over here doing, just hit your widget and do this, because then people feel like they're not a part of something. When everyone sees the vision, they're able to watch it, even at this game quality. Oh, that's what we're making. All of a sudden, everyone's now a part of a team. And what
Perfect.
happens is when you're blind, when you don't really know where you're going or why you're doing it, there's a concept in sports we call, instead of playing to win, it's called playing not to lose. It's not playing to lose, it's called playing not to lose. And with that, in the football, you'd see it where in the third quarter, they stop passing the ball because it's risky, and they just start handing the ball off. You
That's
saw the Atlanta Falcons, blow a giant lead in the Super Bowl. So what happens when people play not to lose means they're everything's about mitigating risk. It's not about succeeding. They're not trying to go scuttle the ship. They're just basically trying to minimize risk as possible and just exist. So what you get is all these departments on set that are separate, that because they don't really know why they're doing something, so to speak, this is very, I mean, I'm saying this very generally. I mean, they generally, know what the scene, but in terms of like how it ties into the overall picture,
Right.
when you get people to believe in a vision, I mean, yeah, that's one way to form a cult, which is, don't go that far, but you're getting people to play as a group and a team. And the way you bind people together is through commonality. And if people have a shared vision, they're like, this is what we're trying to make, and everyone believes in it,
Right.
then now you have on a psychological level, the crew is at its best. They're excited. It's not just a job. They're very excited and happy, and they're giving you their best. Instead of playing not to lose, they're actually coming up with ideas. And that's where, as a filmmaker, what you want is you want to get out of your own ego, and you want to you want to hire the best people you can in the crew and the department heads. And you want to draw on their experience, their creativity, knowing that that group of people you have the overall vision, but in terms of how to execute that overall vision and little pieces, how to add on to it, the crowd is always going to beat the best genius in the world, always. And I've seen filmmakers directors who didn't know what they were doing make great
Right.
films because their department heads and crew were good. And so if you have this thing where now everyone's sharing the vision, they're going to want to contribute creatively to it. And now you're going to pull on all these people's creativity, and you're going to pull on their ingenuity, because every human out there, no matter what, someone has a good idea. Like
That's
you go on, that's why Reddit's so beautiful. Is Reddit, you can have, who knows what this guy does that I've never met, but this one guy has this one crazy idea and you're like, wow, that's genius. And so I see it on the Stable Diffusion forums all the time for AI generation, where some guy who otherwise would be, not someone we would notice, gets inspired and comes up with this amazing. So the crowd will always beat any human. And
right. Right.
when you're working really as a team, that's when it's at its best. And so you have the vision covered, you have a more inspirational team, you save money. So the other part of this is because you've made the movie in prep, so to speak.
Right. What do you call? I was actually going to ask, what do you call that output? Is that like a video storyboard? Is that
I mean, it's like imagine watching a movie, but it's the quality of Halo or Grand
almost
Theft
like
Auto.
a pilot, but
It's
much
like
more
watching, and it's like watching. It's 3D animation, you
3D
know.
animation.
Yeah, but it's representing the movie, but it looks like it's just video game quality animation. And so, but
Got it.
people move and they talk, and so, but that's enough for you to say, I understand what's
Fascinating.
going on. And
Fascinating.
so, but but this is a whole redesign of the workflow of film. But by doing that, because you already know what you're going to shoot before, because you've already made it,
Right.
now you don't have to go get coverage. You don't have to. It's like everything just becomes an asset. How do we get this? How do we get? You take the
Right.
example I use is car driving. So there's four ways to do car driving. If me and you are in a car, there's four ways to do it. There's completely practical, which is me and you are actually in a car driving and they film this, which you never do because it's an insurance nightmare and the sound would never make any sense. So that's only like low budget filmmakers or utilize that. The second one is poor man's process, which is where you're towing the car through the actual city, and you have a camera crew there, and you actually have cameras, but it's mainly a tow job. That's probably traditionally the most common and looks the best, but it costs a lot of money because you have to have what's called ITC road closures, to close the road for you. You have to have other drivers. You have to have a whole crew there. So the cost to entry is high. Green screen is the next one, which has a very low cost to entry, but can skyrocket because you're pricing by the shot. So if it's a really long scene, all of a sudden it's really expensive, but it's easy to throw up a green screen in a parking lot anywhere and just shoot it. There's also the chance that it can look terrible too. So that's another option. The other fourth option is virtual production, which does have a high cost to entry, but if you have a longer scene, you've gotten good footage or have a good game engine behind it, can boom, okay, we're good. Now in post, we don't have to do
Right.
much in theory. Um, so that's for car driving. You could go to any scene, any movie with any attribute and do that same equation. Hey, we're in an office. How should we do this? Oh, should we be on stage? Should we be in location? Well, if you're on stage, it's more controllable, but you have to rent it for a minute amount of time, but you don't have to worry about parking, in theory, or crew parking or base camp. So the moment
Right.
you go on location, you have to worry about all these things, but you don't have to build a set inside. What's the trade-off? And it depends on how long you're there for, how many scenes you need for. I mean, these are classic sort of we call it, it's Moneyball for film. It's Moneyball. It's optimization, sabermetrics type questions of what is the most optimal way to deploy these resources based on our goals. So goal seeking, constraint, here's an optimization. And And in doing this, it sounds all very technical, but in doing this, I think it actually opens up the creativity big time.
Right. Right.
Because if you're able to lower the cost to entry on movies, that means the studios themselves and filmmakers can now take more interesting risks. Like we look at movies like I love City of God, 2002. How does that? It's hard to make those kind of movies now because the amount of money people have to spend, they need something that's guaranteed to give them a return. So they go to existing IP where they think they have a built-in audience or believe they do. So they're trying to mitigate risk once again. So if you can lower the cost, that means they can take greater risk because they can take more shots and they can try to do different stories, because the amount of money in play has been lowered. And
Right.
I think so. I think my hope is that what you have is actually a growth of the amount of movies, so
Right.
that if you say to me right now, "Oh, I'm a crew member, I don't want less days," and I'm like, I'll say, yeah, it's probably going to be annoying to have to switch more, but I think there'll actually be more projects because it'll be cheaper to make them. So you'll end up making the same amount of money. You'll probably just have to switch more, which maybe could be annoying. I understand that, but I think from a long-term sustainability standpoint for the whole industry, it's way better for everyone because when you're financing when this price and this cost, like every time there's a failure, it's a big deal.
Right.
And
Right.
so I would rather see more a greater variety, kind of what streaming's done for us in a lot of the ways.
Right.
But let's make it even more cost effective, and let's you're going to see such a bigger diversity of voices at that point. As America becomes more and more diverse, it's harder and harder for people to have something that appeals to everyone.
That's right.
And we've seen the rise of, like, say, African American film. What we
Right.
haven't seen yet, which is an even bigger group, is the rise of Hispanic content. It's going to take off at some point. They spend more money, per any ethnic group, and there hasn't been a lot for them just yet, and
Right.
it's coming. And you're going to so. How do you find things that appeal to everyone? Well, first of all, that's a weird goal,
Hmm.
and you should just be telling. I think in telling the most human type of stories, with you actually accomplish the greatest outreach. I think
Right.
it's like anything. It's like when you try to be cool, you're not cool. And so if you're trying to make the greatest movie ever, you're not going to make the greatest movie ever.
That
It's
that's
you
right.
know,
And
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 so
I,
yeah,
I can see Chris, that from the last conversation that we had, we had met over a coffee a couple of months ago. You were super excited about AI and some of the applications. Looks like this is really where you're sort of seeing LLMs come in. Is that
yeah. I
is
mean,
that
I've done a lot with generative AI and things like that, but I think that there's a lot of controversy over all that stuff. And it's gonna. I mean, now text to videos, the temporal coherency is starting to get pretty good. Where does that lead us? And I think that I don't I don't see a lot of value in entering that battle. But for optimization, like if I
okay?
say this is a more optimal, there's another project I have. It's we talked about it called Lifecraft that has to do with the fact that we have one commodity in life and it's time. And I don't want to. I want to spend as little as time as possible doing mundane tasks, unless I'm doing it for meditative purposes, which sometimes vacuuming is very like meditative. But like I, I don't want people to have to, type in forms for the sake of typing in forms. If there's things that'll do that, that's not. I
That's
don't think that's why we were here. We weren't here to spend our time doing that,
right.
necessarily, unless you want to. So that's where I'm hoping this technology can be really positive is in examining how we spend our time and how resources are deployed, and how we can fight some of these problems that seem so big, like climate change and things. Some of these problems in the world seem so chaotic, and these things help kind of make sense of them. And it's like what you guys have done. I mean, we talked about that. You know, I told you when we were trying to do get data forever on, what does our total addressable market look like, which is still tenuous. No one had gone out and done what you had done. Well, why? Well, it turned out it was too damn hard, and AI was the only thing that could actually parse and sort through all this data that happens minute
That's
by
right.
minute
That's
and
right.
track all these deals and kind of make sense of it.
That's right.
And so I think that kind of thing is a great example of these changes that we're about to go under and are going right now that's going to affect everything because you
Right.
imagine what a lot of these AI changes are going to bring
Right.
without even wading into like the generative stuff because I'm like, okay, if everyone wants to take away the models that have been trained, fine. Take away those models and everyone will train on private data. Well, Adobe's already done that with Firefly. They've trained on all license and it looks amazing. So, everyone, it's not hard to create your own model if you have the reason. The studios have enough of an archive where they can make their own model at any time or whatever they want. So the whole like who's training on whose data, and the Supreme Court just made a big. I never thought that the artists were going to win that one because the potential. First of all, no one's ever cared about the artists anyway. It's no one's ever. When's the last time someone said, but what about the graphic designers? It's like that was me as a designer going, yeah, it's like that you're just not you're an important part of society, but not really. It's like in terms of like what's really crucial. The courts will always generally rule in terms of what's the interest of the public good.
Right.
Long term. It's the exception of like when they rule for corporate interests every time Disney wants to extend the copyright. But the but if, I think that there's so much data. The thing is, people don't realize how much data gets created every day. Every day, you think of how much data is created on Instagram. It's the reason why Facebook's an AI. They sit on so much amazing data that we all gave away for free.
Right.
Well, we use their service. It's true, but there's so much data being created that the data is incredibly valuable, very, very valuable. The idea that let's all hit reset because we're going to take all the artists, like fine, take all the artist stuff out. These things were trained on billions. People don't understand at that scale that there's so much out there. If I went to the Warner Brothers archive and just trained on that, I would have amazing models.
In fact, I was curious from your vantage point, as you're sort of seeing a host of these new AI tools come up, what's your take on the impact of for VFX as a key component of the industry? Is that
Well,
there are
the,
places where it's
the
already disrupting or it's around the corner?
oh,
Where does
it's
it go?
starting. It's starting to. I mean, it's starting to because of the strikes and everything that got raised during the strikes. Clients are now all of a sudden very interested in licenses and where did this GitHub license come from? That's where it's like, oh, I didn't know you guys knew what GitHub was, but it's because it's now been I mean, what happens? The lawyers raise it and then it goes up the chain and eventually makes its
Yeah,
way to us, and that's, I mean, I think what me and you talked about, we predicted was that where the data comes from could end up being a big deal from a legal standpoint. Now, what that means is I could see a world where the data it's like having a special stamp on things. So where if you have a model that produces something that you
right.
might have to prove the model that you use to produce that thing where they got their data from. And if I think what you're going to end up seeing, this is why I think you saw OpenAI and big things in front of Congress asking for regulation. They don't want regulation. What they want to do is they want to make it so it's too hard for the little guys to get in. When they're in front of Congress asking for regulation, they're not altruistic. What they're trying to do is make it way harder for anyone to enter into the stadium. And that same week when Sam Altman was in Congress asking for regulations, he was in Europe fighting against regulations. And so, and you've seen, I probably saw that internal memo from Google 6 months ago where they said there's no, open source is going to, eviscerate them. Sorry, I thought I heard my son down there.
Sure, sure.
And they're all, they're very concerned about open source, saying they basically said that we had no moat was the memo. And because once again, the crowd as a whole, they can't compete with. And
That's right.
so what do? Oh, well, the railroad, you go back to the robber barons in the late 19th century in the US, they used to go in front of Congress and ask for regulations.
Right.
Why? Well, it stops, if especially in like, petroleum. Well, if we could stop everyone else from entering, we could monopolize the whole thing. So that's why, I mean, they're all standing to make a crap ton of money off this stuff. They see what it is, know what it is. They invented half of it.
Right. Right.
So what are we going to do? Oh, let's keep everyone else out of the party. And so I could see something. I can't remember the name of it. Adobe's a big supporter of this, where they're talking about having these special digital watermarks on images that are very like hard to get rid of and baked in on a certain layer that's hard to get to. That basically means if you don't have one of these stamps, then you're not an officially licensed image that came from let's call it free range AI. It's like organic AI or whatever. That
Right.
oh,
Right.
you might have come from one of the evil models that was illegally trained or whatever.
Uh-huh.
What they're doing is so that they got the independent artists on board who are being extra loud about all this stuff, because you can understand why they're being loud about it, but What Adobe's hiding behind them and saying, "Oh, we need this licensing." Well, why do they want that? Well, guess what? Who's one of the only people that has the database and can afford to train them off? Oh, Adobe. Oh, so guess what? So the idea that Adobe gives a shit about these artists is hilarious. And so, but the artists look for anyone to come on their side because they're really kind of getting outgunned here. So that they're like, oh, sure, we'll take it. But what's going to happen is you're going to end up in a world where if you don't have that stamp, well, it doesn't mean you did something illegal, but we don't really know. So it's imagine you had to wear an armband that says like, I'm not a criminal everywhere, and you forgot there was that date. Well, it means you could be. I mean, it's a reverse of our whole system, which is,
Right, right, right.
it's kind of you sort of assume, that things are fine. You don't assume everything's bad at first. It's presumed innocent, not just in the legal sense, but in the cultural sense. And so I think that's very scary if you allow that to happen and allow private enterprise to all of a sudden control what's acceptable and what's not. And it's like what a lot of the lawyers are doing. Like, they're like, well, we don't know, but we're gonna justify our own existence by telling you there's a threat.
Right,
And
right, right, right.
it's like I knew a guy who just this is one of the funniest things I've heard. He's a genius deepfake guy. And he told him, I'm like, oh, you made one of the best models in the world. Like, what's your next invention? He goes, oh, world's best deepfake detector. Uh,
Aha.
Genius. And
That's
it's
it's the
you know,
it's the model for the pharma industry in a way.
yeah. Oh, you got a disease. Oh, it turns out we gave you disease, but here's the cure. And
That's right.
so it's
Fascinating.
that's it's hard to find the time for any of us in our lives to pull back to see all these forces at play.
Right,
We
right.
see, I remember I was on a panel a few months ago, and someone in the crowd started yelling at me about AI, as if I was, like they wanted somebody yelling about it. I happened to be the proponent of it, and they were like, well, Elon Musk wants to press pause on it. And I'm like, dude, he only wants to press pause so he can catch up. What are you talking about? Like, do you really? But like, it was, and so there's a lot of fear around this stuff. I think with VFX, it's what's hard about the AI stuff right now in terms of diffusion models. Now, GANs were a little different, but diffusion models can produce amazing stuff, but it's very hard to control specifically. You can't say, in VFX, we get very specific. Move this hair here, move the camera forward 6 inches, do this, do this. When it comes to that, like AI is not there right now. And it could be, I mean, it's moving so fast, it's hard to say, and I'm sure it'll be able to accomplish most things. But we will hit a certain fundamental plateau with certain concepts where directors that are used to something are going to ask for something, and we're going to be like, oh, we can't exactly do that. So if you kind of say, like, I generally want to do this thing, I
Right.
think, we're getting there where it's like, oh, I need a tool running down the street. Okay, I can give you something like that fairly quickly, or we're very close to getting there. You saw what, Pika dropped yesterday, what Runway's doing. But if it's like, oh, I want to have you do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, that's a bit, it's going to take a minute. It's going to
Right.
take a second to get there. And
So,
so,
I mean, look from a Vitrina standpoint, we kind of monitoring the entire supply chain, really from story and concept right up to the windowing of that content where all it appears, right? And this is a philosophical question, Chris, which is, are you seeing AI replace big chunks of the supply chain, or do you see the AI keeping the supply chain pretty much intact, but making it faster, better, maybe automating some of the stuff, but yet the supply chain will remain the supply chain? I mean, I'd love to get your perspective from where you're seeing VFX and a host of the other scripting aspects that you talked about.
well, I mean, let's look at the current supply chain, and then let's imagine we have these tools, and then imagine what the most efficient version of that would look like based on the goal. So it's the current supply chain. If you look at every piece of it, where could it accelerate? Well, there's what I'm doing. There's the screenplay analysis. There's tying that screenplay analysis to different things. There's analysis of what the market's looking for.
Right.
So what's the most? I mean, the gold standard would be, okay, Atul, I have $1 million. Where should I spend this right now in the entertainment industry? What kind of content should I make to maximize the return of my dollar? You
That
know,
we get asked that question
yeah. That's what
every day.
anyone wants to know.
That's
But people forget that that equation is not so simple because a lot of it has to do with risk tolerance. Well, what's your risk tolerance?
that's
It's
right.
like people forget that it's that equation. That question can't actually be answered without you providing more input to things like risk tolerance or
Context of the
investment.
markets and yeah,
It's
cultures
like
and yeah,
you don't know that unless you're backwards looking.
that's
Um,
right.
so I think it's in terms of the money. I think you're going to see a lot there. Like I don't need an algorithm right now to tell me
Hmm.
that unscripted is probably the way to put place to put your dollars right now. But if I had a model that said that, I could make the investors feel a lot better.
Right,
So and you can see, and then therefore get more money for it.
right,
So that stuff's really useful for people. If you look at people, the sort of KPIs people use, what do people use KPIs for? Well, people that are not in the industry use it to give their best understanding of an industry. If you're in an industry, you don't really care about the KPIs because you know what's really going on.
that's right,
But
that's right.
KPIs are kind of like a common language, very blunt one, I might say, of trying to understand the picture. So I think the starting off at the beginning, the money, the development, yeah, I think there's an effect there for sure.
Okay.
Um, predicting, consumer behavior, where the eyeballs go, that's going to get better and better because this stuff's all about simulation of behavior.
Right, right.
Then you go to like, okay, like I said, well, pre-production, well, that's what I'm talking about. Previs, pre-production. I mean, I'm not the only guy with this type of idea, but that's, so where I think people, where it's going to get weird, and I don't really know, is let's talk about actual production. Okay, we've done all the planning of how this is going to happen, the
Right.
optimization. That's all good, but we still need humans on the ground with cameras. Okay, so first of all, let's understand that within a few years, I don't know if it's 2 years, I don't know if it's 25 years, there will be a point when we can make photoreal stuff completely in the computer without ever turning the camera.
I
That
mean, we're seeing imagery that's astonishing, right? I mean,
no,
mid-journey.
that's from no. I spend
That's right.
an inordinate amount of time in those programs. Like um, every time there's a press release, one of my bots catches it. And I look at the newest, like yesterday when SDXL Turbo dropped. I saw it right. I'm like, holy cow! I'm like, um, okay, so let's assume that's going to happen. What does that mean? Well, first of all, I'm going to say I don't know. I don't know much of anything. So, but I'll say that. But I can tell you what I think is going to happen. Anytime you lower the barrier to entry on something, you end up with a lot of noise. So all of a sudden, if it's really if it's like really hard to be a blacksmith 400 years ago and training all this stuff, and then all of a sudden the industrial revolution comes along that can produce this stuff in factories at scale. Well, what happens? And all of a sudden you get noise, you get a flood of things. So then, what's the reaction to that? Okay, well, if you look at say YouTube, so you've got so much content you couldn't watch it 100 lifetimes. And so, what do we do anytime there's noise? Well, we use curators to, we have to add a layer to filter the content to tell us where we should pay attention. There's too much to pay attention to. What should we pay attention to? And so, and remember, this whole thing is about a competition for our time, our eyeballs. That's what marketers want. So, um, the so now we have, if everyone can go make their own personal movie just by typing stuff in and say, I want to make them show me a movie about, me like saving kids from a burning bus, while dressed as a fish,
Right,
whatever.
right.
I mean, first of all, let's all understand there's going to be so much porn that's where most of it's going to be. So
That's
let's just understand that right now.
yeah.
Let's not kid ourselves.
Right. That's
Um,
right.
but what happens there? Well, people used to say that when movies came along, that the theater would die. Well, from what I can tell, the theater's still here. And
Right.
there seems to be people that, is it as alive and well as it was? I don't actually know, but there seems to be a lot of plays I can go see on any given weekend. And, they said, video, killed the radio star. Why would you ever, why would, you know, and now you see this hilarious, this resurgence of vinyl. I think that there's a natural order and balance to things, and that media, you have mediums that are designed to solve problems, but then you have mediums that are actually have an intrinsic value on their own.
Right.
And
Right.
I think there will be something that, why is the theater there? Well, the thing about seeing a theater play versus a film is it feels like there's something much more connected to humanity about it. You're there, and I'll admit I'm not a big theater person, although I've watched a lot of it. But when you talk to actors, and that's really among actors, the internal pecking order is the stage is where the best that's where they do their best work. That's where they judge each other. It's not about winning Academy Awards. That's more of a political game. It's
Right.
on the stage is the actors meeting,
That's
you
right.
know, the film's the directors meeting, whatever. But the and so and why is that? And I think it's there's something watching something happen live in front of you
Right.
with people when you're there and you can touch them, you know, there's something human about that. And I think there's something within us that human proximity and that human experience, that human touch, you know, like it's like COVID. Like I like the whole working from home thing in terms of the flexibility it gives people.
Right.
But the downside is that the social bonds that get created through being in the trenches together are eroded.
Yeah.
And granted,
I mean,
I
so I was just extending, Chris, what you were saying, which is that finally these powerful stories that make us laugh and cry, and we go there on an emotional roller coaster to either have our highs or our lows or our fear and so on and so forth. For AI to really sort of replicate both the storytelling, the power of that storytelling, and also the acting of those emotions, for us to really feel behind the screen, on the other side of the screen, the same emotion that the storyteller wants us to feel, or the actor wants us to feel. It's really, really hard, right?
no, it's what I like about AI is I think it because of logistics it democratizes a lot of this.
Right,
So
right,
traditionally only certain people got to make films because the cost of entry was so high that to get the skills necessary to do it, you kind of had to come from an aristocratic, you had a lot of times from a wealthy background. I observed this in LA when I wanted to direct that a lot of directors came from wealthy backgrounds where on a hierarchy of needs level, they didn't have to worry about food and shelter, so they were able to put in the
right,
time to gain the skills to direct.
right,
Which is one of the reasons I started crafting is I wanted to make enough money so I could learn to direct by being on set, but also eventually be able to invest my own money in productions because it's so hard, so it that limited the access. So we really don't know who the best filmmakers the last 100 years would be because the best ones probably never got a chance to even step up to the plate. And
that's right,
if the democratization is down, you might see someone who's an incredible storyteller. And because you think of how many things you have to be good at, not just logistically, but politically to be a film director. You have to be good at so much stuff. It's almost impossible. You can have a genius, but is politically like can't deal with people or whatever, bad communicator, and so they don't get to go. They don't get to make films. But maybe they're. It's curious if, given all everything else being equal, if we all just had in front of us the ability to tell the best story we could in a computer, who the best people would emerge. That's what's going to be interesting about it is what
that's
kind of bizarre, as you lower the barrier to entry,
right,
all of a sudden it's going to flood these people that couldn't have gotten in the door before. But it's so hard to measure this kind of talent that you don't know unless you put them in there. And so, but it's like right now. Right now, you see is a lot of like demos. You see video. Look, we can do this, but none of that matters because without having my thing is, don't I agree with what you're saying? Without having the human meaning behind something,
that's
and
right,
that meaning that people connect with, it's nothing more than a stock footage demo reel, SIGGRAPH or NAV. Nobody cares. That image, you think of like the most powerful images in film, and what they would mean if you didn't have the rest of the context around it.
that's right,
Like, oh, it's just a guy, crying, big deal. But all of a sudden, you see the rest of the movie and you're like, oh, that's why he's crying. It resonates.
right,
So the meaning behind things is always the ultimate. Without meaning, there's nothing. It's pointless.
that's right, that's right,
And so AI doesn't, it's like I think about unscripted because I'm going to do some unscripted stuff documentary wise. And I told someone, I go, as much as I love AI, I go, this is an area that's protected from AI. Although I think you can optimize a lot of the making of it, I go, find me an AI that's going to actually go out to some rural part of the country and interview some guy about a murder.
right,
It doesn't, I mean, sure, if you had his voice, you could replicate, but it's not the actual thing of like going out and talking to someone for whatever reason your documentaries, and that's what documentaries and unscripted are.
Right.
AI can do a lot from narrative, but unscripted, sure, you can generate stuff all day long,
Yeah.
but it's not real. So if I want to, if it turns out tomorrow that I'm a serial killer or something, and you want to come interview me, well, AI doesn't help you at all there.
Right.
It'll help with the transcription and stuff, but in terms of actually going and getting the footage, no.
Right.
And
That's
so there's a lot of areas that are naturally siloed and protected from this.
we on the supply chain side, one of the things that we've started as an initiative, and Chris, I'm going to come back to you on that separately. Uh, One of the things that we've started doing is really looking at which solutions within the supply chain are AI powered. So there's a lot of requests from a lot of our users, especially on the buy side and the production side, saying, can you tell us which are the localization companies that are AI powered and are using AI, or which are the post-production companies which are
It's
using
really
AI?
funny that they just broadly use AI as this
And and then,
like
so,
it's
so what
crack.
we're trying to do is to really sort of peel the layer as a supply chain player to really sort of put that perspective. But one uh, again, coming to the end of the year, a lot of our members and our network will be sort of wondering about how 2024 is going to play out. My last question really to you was going to be relating to what's your outlook for 2024? What are the things that you're saying to your teams as the new year is starting out? That'd be great point for us to end the conversation.
I don't think it's going to come back as fast as it did post COVID.
Okay.
As we talked about before, the interest rates, the debt markets, I think there's some skittishness in terms of the kind of projects people make and where they put their money. And if you look at, Netflix is very much tied to their stock prices. At least they can take a lot of risks, and they do, which is cool. Amazon and Apple, it's hard to tell because it's not their core business.
That's right.
So they could take a lot of interesting shots. And you kind of see where they're going. Like Amazon is a little broader. They're spending a lot of money, and they can go high, they can go low. They don't care. Apple is basically all pure polish. Like someone
Yep.
commented to me the other day. Like
It,
Apple's like sticking with their brand of like we don't touch anything that's trashy remotely. Like it's all even the stuff that's like a comedy like feels like it's got this gloss over it. It's just it's very much it's all very good. It's very like um elite sort of, and so
right, right, right.
um and then you have, Disney feels like they're trying to reinvent right now. I mean, for years you look at, Box Office Mojo or whatever, and Disney was the leader in the pack, making the fewest films, but making the most money. They had the biggest sort of broad brand thing. And now you saw last weekend that, they just had their worst performing Marvel movie ever. I don't know what the write down on it's going to be, but that might have been like an oil well that got tapped for too long. I don't know. And it could be, I was talking to someone today about how they might have cheapened that brand by putting it on Disney Plus.
Right.
And by creating streaming brands. Same with Star Wars. We knew once they got it and they paid $4 billion for it, they're going to exploit the hell out of it. Um, how far do you take that before you cross the Rubicon and now you devalue the entire thing because there's just too much out there. And then you got Paramount, which is hurting in a lot of ways. They're all hurting. Warner has a massive, debt note that Zlotov was brought in to pay down. And I mean, that stuff just doesn't pay itself down. It's like
You
they have
have
to find a way to make content without spending money. Like, so
and
it's like, um,
yeah,
you know, so I mean, they have to, it's their job. They have to make money and they have to produce content. So they're going to figure it out. I'm predicting that supply chain wise, I don't know this, but I'm bracing for like compared to 22 or something, like a 30 or 40% reduction, looking more like 2017, 18. But you really don't know. We always it seemed like that to my and your generation, theaters were a certain thing. But as other things have come out that compete for our time, they're from our phones to the internet, all these things, that theaters they've lost their place as a cultural staple. They're still there, but they're not holding this sort of high threshold that they did in, like, say, the 70s, 80s, 60s, whatever. That other things finally came in, and they have to find their new balance, and that streaming's where most stuff's because. as we all know, the experience of film is going to have to step up to get us to go. And we see things now that are normal that 20 years. I mean, the idea that I go to a theater, I have a lay down seat. It's basically a first class airplane seat. I can order food and drinks with alcohol and have them brought to me without leaving. It's like that's a normal experience now. That was an incredibly new elite experience. So they're going to have to keep on finding ways but I think film probably becomes more, theaters probably start to skew towards a more specialized luxury thing.
Experiential sort of maybe 3D, 4D, ish.
I don't know if it's gonna. There'll be some stuff like that in like the ride thing, but I think it's gonna be for certain types of films. You
Okay.
know, things that it could be that who knows? Maybe the model, maybe streaming becomes kind of like we'll call it the boot camp or minor leagues, where certain films would then emerge. But I think we're going to see different things. As people have been experimenting, they're showing live sporting events in theaters now. They're showing even television marathons, television episodes of premiere. There's other ways when you sit there and say, I have a seat with the screen and a premium experience. Well, you're not just tied to films. I think with the Paramount decrees being gone, I think whether Apple, does Amazon buy a theater chain that's hurting and turn it into Amazon Prime Experience, and then you have other
Wow.
things there besides theaters, so they can show their streaming stuff there, but they also could show the Super Bowl.
That's a pretty powerful headline to sort of look at the industry saying that, maybe 30% lower than the peak. And
I mean, the peak was so much. That's the thing. Is like there's still plenty of work, and I think a lot of the stuff's going to spread globally. I think that I'm talking mainly I'm talking North America here. I'm not
North America,
talking,
that's right.
but that's not, because I know you guys are global, but like
That's right.
the people don't realize, it sounds like a bad headline, like spending reduced 30-40%. It's like, well, hold on a second here. Let's get some context. And let's remember that 21 and 22 were unprecedented. Like
Yeah.
they were like, it's like when the '08 when oil was $150 a barrel. That's not
Actually,
normal.
the 22 number would have kept going had the Netflix stock price had not hit a sort of barrier, right? That was one point where there was a little bit of a correction in 22 numbers, but otherwise it was like where is the peak? It kept going up and up and up.
No, well, because of COVID, there was nothing else to do, so media companies
Right.
obviously go up, and because there's a time delay on everything,
Yep.
they are when COVID hit, they already had libraries stacked up for a while.
That's right.
And it's even during the strike. They're gonna be fine because they sit on this stuff for a while. So there's a whole cadre of stuff they can pull out. They're not done. And
Right.
so I mean, like I said, no one really knows what's going to happen. I'm predicting sort of a more sort of tenuous entrance back into it by the studios and by the people spending money. I'm seeing stuff on Vitrina and other services where, yeah, stuff's being announced, being made, but it's not the wildfire that it was
That's right.
before.
That's right. No, I think I would echo that. We're seeing sort of much more, measured, sort of cautious, moves by players. One of the things that, we're doing a webinar tomorrow relating to this. We've seen massive amounts of IP optioning that has happened. So, chances are that we'll actually see a big revival in early part of next year. But hey, Chris, just want to
Yeah.
thank you from the entire Vitrina family and our member network for your time today. This was great. I mean, we actually got a lot of stuff covered, both for VFX, the state of the industry today, LLMs and AI, and also a little bit of an outlook for 2024. Just want to thank you for your time today and for a very exciting and wonderful conversation.
No, thanks for having me. You guys really have a unique and wonderful service, and yeah, no, I'm really optimistic about where it's all headed. I just think people have to, like anything with Darwinism, they just have to be prepared for adaptation. Then they'll be fine.
That's right.
So.
Fantastic. Fabulous.